Buonasera.
Good evening. So welcome to this event of the Festival of Economics dedicated to growth, environment, at this current time in the world, which is a bit tragic. And we are really here to understand the possible consequences of the current changes. My name is Eugenio OCCORSIO. I am a journalist of La Repubblica, an Italian daily. And we have a very interesting person here, Gernot WAGNER. I say Wagner because I like to say Wagner because it recalls the musician, but I should say Wagner. So he's an environmental economist, and he teaches at the New York University. He writes for Bloomberg Green. And for many years, he has been focusing on this issue. He's the author of Climate Shock, which was written a few years ago about the economic consequences of climate changes. Well, I read the book, and there is a note which is very interesting for me about structural changes due to the tragic pandemic, that is the spreading of teleworking or smart working, as you may call it. And Wagner notes that this technology is actually increasing with a lot of savings in terms of pollution, because it's fewer cars, fewer buses, fewer aeroplanes. So all these internet technologies, video conferences are evolving rapidly. And well, this is a particularly important aspect in the light or in the wake of the COVID pandemic. And then in the book, there is a discussion about the costs of climate changes, which are really huge in terms of GDP. It's about 3-4% every year. There are changes also in the hydrological structure of the world. And by the way, today we got the news from California that the wildfires of last summer, of this summer, cost between $4 and $8 billion. And the governor of the state of California, unlike what Trump did, decided that starting from 2035, no fuel cars will circulate, but just electric cars. So that's the objective of the governor of California. And then every day we read in the news that there are rising waters, glaciers which are really melting down, or expansion of desert areas, and then increasing inequalities, of course, because the most hit areas are actually the poorest areas, and so there is increase in poverty, uncontrolled migration, and all that has human consequences, but also economic consequences. And that's the topic of Gernot Wagner's presentation. So I'll give you the floor, and after your speech, we will have a Q&A session. I know that you would have liked to be in Trento, which is a very beautiful city in the north of Italy. Next year, you will be here, I'm sure. You have the floor.
Hopefully, yes. Thank you. Thank you very much. And yes, I am here in New York City right now, unfortunately, not in Italy. Now, let me start with saying what I won't be talking about. which is I won't be talking about what we know about climate change, climate economics. Suffice it to say, what we do know is bad enough. We should have acted a long time ago, and when I say we, of course, this is the global policy community, to rein in CO2 emissions. What I would like to talk about instead is what we don't know, the risks, the uncertainties, the sort of things where, frankly, we as economists simply are not quite sure. We might have a good sense. We can guess. We can guesstimate what the right answers ought to be. But more often than not, we simply don't know, and we still have to pick some number often in order to draw some conclusions. So to start with, there are sort of two canonical facts in of economics of climate change that actually have a surprising link to, frankly, the world we currently live in, the COVID-19 pandemic. One is, more often than not, whatever it is we are looking at, we are not looking at linear changes. We are not looking at how, if one variable changes, something else has an effect, and there is a tight relationship between the two. What we are looking at more often than not are exponential changes, rapid changes, things spinning out of control. And just to give you a sense, and I will not pretend to be an epidemiologist here. I am not. I pretend to be one on Twitter, but that's a different story. But over the last 6 months or so, right, all of us have seen terms like this, the reproductive factor of COVID-19. Right, if you happen to be listening to the German Chancellor's Angela Merkel's press conferences, right? She, as a trained physicist, trained chemist, sort of been known to emphasize the specifics here. We in the US, unfortunately, are not quite as lucky. But yes, numbers like this, right? The reproductive coefficient of COVID-19, how many people on average one person is infecting, matters a lot. Okay, so just to use this as an example of how much exponential growth matters. A coefficient of 1 means I, on average, infect one other person, right? Well, coefficient of 2 or coefficient of 3, right? Means I infect 2 people or I infect 3 people on average if I have COVID-19. And of course, right, the goal ultimately is to get this number below 1 for it to not to reproduce. Okay, so that's the starting point, right? And there is a difference in 2x and 3x, right? This seems to be twice as bad. That seems to be 3 times as bad. Well, it turns out that's not the right way to think about it, right? 2 is not twice as bad as 1. 2 is much, much worse compared to 1. And of course, there are lots of different ways to think about this, but one way is to line up 10 people and say, after 10 interactions, how many people will the 10th person on average infect, right? How many infections will we see after 10 interactions? Well, without doing too much math here, if the factor is 1, after 10 interactions, we are still left with 1. A total of 10 people infected, but the 10th interaction, we have 1 new person infected. Okay, what about 2? It's not twice as bad. It is 1,000 times as bad, right? Approximately 1,000. It's 1,024. It's not twice as bad. It's 1,000 times as bad. What about a factor of 3? Without doing too much math here, we are looking at approximately 60,000. Right? That's exponential growth. That is the reason why Nicolas Sarkozy Emmanuel Macron, French president, current French president, on Friday goes to the theater with his wife, demonstrating normalcy. On Tuesday, his culture minister gets infected, and on Thursday, the entire country is shut down. Right? That is exponential growth within days. Now, with climate change, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on your perspective, it is simply not playing out over days. It's playing out over years, over decades, over centuries. Now, when I say fortunately, right, the fortunate part is we don't have runaway climate change that is literally happening over days. But the problem is there is no immediate reaction. There's no immediate consequence to our action or inaction today, right? Whether or not we pass climate policy today makes essentially zero difference to temperatures tomorrow or next week or even next year. It affects what happens in decades, in centuries. Never mind that, yes, there too, it is all about this exponential growth. Things don't get worse linearly. Things get worse exponentially. Now, of course, with climate, we are not talking about the reproductive coefficient of a disease here, of a virus. We are talking about temperature changes, and then we are talking about the impact in dollars or euros, right, in monetary terms. Well, the principle is exactly the same. When you go from 1 degree to 2 degrees to 3 degrees and so on, things don't just get slightly worse, they get a lot worse, exponentially worse. And that principle is, frankly, very difficult, really difficult to explain. Nobody, hardly anyone, has an intuitive grasp of this. As we've just seen the last 6 months, political leaders the world over, they had a very steep learning curve, right? Learning within days, weeks, sometimes, hopefully. But still, it is a very, very difficult concept to understand that a change of 2 here doesn't make things twice as bad. It makes things many, many times as bad. That is probably the most fundamental concept in all of climate economics that is very difficult to wrap our heads around. And timescales don't help. The fact that we are talking about decades and centuries doesn't help at all. I promise no more math, no more calculations here, but to my second point about how what we don't know makes a much bigger difference than what we do know. So probably the most important figure that nobody has ever heard of, few have heard of, this room now excluded here, but the most important figure in many ways deciding the future on this planet as we know it, the impacts of climate change, the long-term impacts of climate change, is something called the social cost of carbon. Technically, the social cost of CO2. What is that? Other than the most important figure determining life on this planet as we know it, it is the cost that each ton of CO2 emitted today causes over its lifetime. And yes, that stuff sticks up there for a while, right? Every ton emitted today, half of it is still there 1,000 years from now, plus minus a few hundred years. This is a long-term problem. What we do today, what we do in the coming decade or two, determines outcomes centuries, millennia hence. And of course, we are pumping much too much CO2 into the atmosphere. So the economists' take on this is, well, we can calculate that impact. We can do a calculation, and an earlier speaker here at the festival, Bill Nordhaus, Nobel laureate, he won a Nobel Prize essentially for being first in attempting this calculation. The world's most ambitious benefit cost analysis, more long-term, more global, more uncertain, more irreversible, more consequential than almost any other public policy problem out there. Unique probably in the combination of those factors, long-term, global, uncertain. Okay. And meanwhile, the number that comes out of these calculations matters. It matters a lot. And it changes a lot based on some fundamental assumptions that are frankly very, very difficult to pin down. So just to give you a sense here of the order of magnitudes involved. By now, for quite a while, for about a decade or so, that number, the cost that each ton of CO2 emitted today causes, and by the way, right, the average American emits about 20 of these tons, average European around 10. I'm a dual citizen, I get 30, so every one of these 30 tons, 20 tons for an American, causes approximately, according to very standard calculations, around $50, right? 45, 50 euros per ton of CO2. That's the standard calculation. It's been with us for a while. Meanwhile, there are lots and lots of assumptions that feed into it that make it so. And in many cases, we simply don't have the correct answer. Some of the more fundamental assumptions are precisely the climate damages, how changes in temperature translates into damages, right? That is one. A second fundamental assumption, there was another prior speaker today, Christian Gollier, who spent many, many years focused on this very problem, the discount rate. How should those long-term damages, decades, centuries hence, be discounted back to today? Okay, let's just take those two as an example. Bill Nordhaus's standard benefit cost analysis makes certain assumptions about damages, as anyone has to do. And frankly, it has been making those assumptions for around 25 years, since 1992, when he first published those results. The fundamental assumption, damages are related to changes in degrees centigrade through a quadratic function, right? So we know there is no linear relationship. It is not a straight line. As temperatures increase, damages increase quadratically. Meanwhile, when we look at lines like this, right, let's say this here is the quadratic version, there is no way to tell whether a slightly different version with maybe a different number up here is the more correct extrapolation, the more correct assumption, frankly, largely because we have no idea what happens out here. in a world that, frankly, nobody of us has ever seen. Lots and lots of assumptions. Well, the difference here, even though there's a lot of uncertainty, makes a huge difference in the final outcome. Standard assumption, $50, slightly different damages. We are looking at numbers suddenly much greater than 100 or even larger. Huge difference in outcome, slight difference in assumptions, and frankly, very little we know. Currently, climate scientists know, climate economists know about which of these assumptions is correct. Second number, I mentioned the discount rate, the importance of the discount rate. The basic assumption that's been with us for a while is what feeds into these calculations is a discount rate of around 4.25%. That's the Bill Nordhaus's standard assumption. The US government under President Obama took a slightly different view, used 3%, slightly lower, and hence the social cost of carbon, this $50 number, in fact was $50 as opposed to lower, below those $50. Meanwhile, ever so slight changes here, only decreasing the discount rate to something like 2.5%. Not much, right? Much like the COVID coefficient here, the difference here isn't very big. For discount rate itself, the difference in outcome is enormous. And here too, yet again, we are looking at social cost of carbon figures of much greater than 100. Everything else the same. And frankly, these are just two illustrative examples here of the difference. There are larger questions around uncertainties that increase this number much, much larger still. Fat tails, as just one example, right? The risk of high consequence, low probability events, tipping points, the sort of surprises in the climate system, or for that matter in us, in society, in how we react to those surprises. Right? The underlying temperature change may not be all that much, but we as society react in, frankly, surprising ways. And suddenly you have enormous economic costs that once again make a huge difference in the outcome, even though our standard models in many ways don't capture that difference. One last point, and I will leave it at this. Just to be clear, this doesn't look like much versus a number that is greater than $100. The difference is, in fact, enormous. On the left, just now here talking a bit about US politics, $50-ish per ton of CO2 is essentially what by now is an ExxonMobil supported set of bipartisan carbon tax bills introduced in this Congress. Right? It's not going to be law in the current environment, the current political environment, but even now we see carbon tax bills introduced in Congress that are somewhere around $40, $50 per ton of CO2 today. And when I say ExxonMobil supported, yes, by now there's a coalition of oil companies that support that say, yes, this is the number, we can get behind that, we want a carbon tax, or at least tacitly support a carbon tax this magnitude, $50. If $100 and more is the right number, if the number on the right is correct, or frankly, we just don't know. It might be 100, it might be 200, it might be more. We just don't know. Suddenly, we are in Green New Deal territory. Suddenly, we are looking at Joe Biden's $2 trillion climate investment plan. Suddenly, we are looking at much, much more ambitious climate policy. Suddenly, the policy instrument is very different. A carbon tax won't do. We won't be able to look at $100, $150 more and say, oh yeah, there's just a simple, clean carbon tax bill and it'll solve everything. No, there is, frankly, in many ways, politically, no way to get there. And more importantly, it's not even the right tool. If the right number per ton of CO2 is $100 or more, the right tool isn't to say all we need is a price on carbon and we can get out of the way. It is a much, much more fundamental transformation of the economy. On the left, we might be looking at sort of evolutionary change on the margin, the things that economists are often very comfortable thinking about. On the right, that's a revolution. That is a much, much more fundamental transition, well beyond tinkering a little bit on the margin, trying to introduce carefully, let's say, a carbon tax, a carbon price, a cap and trade system. That's just a very, very different environment. So with that, let me stop here, and I look forward to the discussion.
Professore, grazie mille di questa sua...
Thank you very much, Professor Wagner. Thank you for this quite alarming scenario that you depicted. There's one thing that I wish to say. You just talked about the carbon tax, about the difficulty there are in introducing this carbon tax, and you also said that it could be useful. But apart from the carbon tax, considering that the carbon tax would do something, but apart from that, many things are happening worldwide. Electric cars are being produced, and our habits as consumers are improving. We've got separate waste collection, and the management of waste or resources is certainly advanced in developed countries. As you said in your book, we are teaching our children to close the tap of water when they are brushing their teeth. We're teaching our children to put plastic glasses or plastic and glass in the right container. So these are little habits that, in a way, contribute to the environmental balance, and this obviously should lead to a reduction in the emission of CO2, which is really the culprit, which is really the villain. And industry, likewise, are getting equipped, adopting circular economy, recycling policies, so much so that there are diffuse actions being taken on a large scale, perhaps not exponential scale, but there are measures being taken. And apart from economists, scholars, environmentalists, there's a wide cultural movement on anthropologists, social scientists, expert in ethics and moral issues, and this is somewhat slowing down the dramatic curve. Do you think so, or do you think that this is not enough, or is the phenomenon irreversible already?
Let me address it this way. So I don't have a driver's license. I'm a vegetarian. You are looking at all of our 70 square meters right here, a small apartment in Lower Manhattan, in the center of a city. Should we be doing these things? Should we be using our recycled water bottles or the fancy wooden espresso cup? Yes, of course, right? It's the moral thing to do. Yes. Does it make a difference? Does individual behavior change make a difference? No, it does not. It cannot. And just to give you a sense, frankly, the last 6 months has shown that. We literally just went back to our caves or to our apartments, right? We shut down. We did. We shut down our economies the world over, right? China first, then the rest of the world followed. Nobody left home for 3 months, or at least we shouldn't have. What happened to emissions? The most extreme measures we can imagine. Emissions globally at the peak in April declined by something like 17%, less than 20%, less than a fifth. And that's just emissions, right? We are still adding CO2 to the atmosphere. It's like if your bathtub is overflowing and you turn down the spigot by 20%. No, you have to turn it down to 0. Otherwise, water will still accumulate in the bathtub. And of course, meanwhile, right, we are back to a net decrease of emissions somewhere between 3-4%. On net for the whole year, 2020, emissions might go down globally by something like 3 or 4%. Is that good? Yes. Is it good that we fly less these days? Yes, up to a point, right? I wished I could be with you today in Trento, of course. But frankly, there are lots and lots of conferences in Cleveland, Ohio, where I would much rather not be in a hotel in Cleveland right about now, and where I like being in New York, where I like having my kids behind me do their Taekwondo class as we speak, and I'll have dinner with them right after I'm with you, right? There are advantages here. There are real advantages here. That said, right, of course, there were real costs associated with the lockdown. There are real economic costs, lots of them. Meanwhile, emissions barely decreased. And even at the peak, the 20% just isn't enough. So what all of this tells me is, first, individual action just isn't enough. Again, should we be doing these things? Yes, of course. It's the moral thing to do, right? We teach our kids to turn off the water when they brush their teeth. Yes, of course. Or we should all be, living in smaller homes and driving less. Yes, sure. By all means, let's not be actively immoral, right? Pope Francis is onto something. Of course, yes. But individual action, individual responsibility just isn't going to do this. What it takes, right, is more economic activity, more investment. Like literally, right? Actually, decreasing emissions is not going back to our caves doing less. It is more activity. It is more investment. It is China announcing this Tuesday, right, 3 days ago, that it will be carbon neutral by 2060. Emissions peak by 2030. That was its prior commitment. It will probably achieve this peak much sooner, actually, maybe even by 2025 or so, middle of this decade, because of fundamental forces, market forces, and policy. And then announcing that it will continue this path and decrease its emissions much, much further down the line. Now, yes, right now, China is building coal plants. Yes, right now, part of its stimulus, yes, there was a green component to that too, but lots of the money went into fossil fuels. Those are steps backwards. Meanwhile, the fundamental forces point in the right direction. And yes, it takes policy. It takes NDRC, the National Development and Reform Commission, in its next 5-year plan from 2021 through 2025 to enshrine the transition that is necessary to achieve carbon neutrality by 2060 in its laws, in its plans. It takes much, much more. It takes rechanneling fundamental economic forces. It does not take you and me sipping our water from water bottles or recycling. That is not the way to decrease CO2 emissions.
Beh, insomma, certo che però non scoraggiamo i nostri
Well, let's not discourage our citizens from using these behaviors, so we shouldn't say that it is useless. Well, something that deniers say, is that in the history of man and also in prehistory, there have always been temperature changes. And there is perhaps a reference in your book, let's say 3,000 years ago, the seas were higher than today. And indeed, we have fossils in some regions in Italy. Don't you think that this could be one of those dramatic times, and then there will be a spontaneous improvement of the situation? Or do you think that the impact of CO2 will be decisive for the fate of the planet?
I do think that. Now, just to be clear, it wasn't 3,000 years ago. It was 3 million years ago, over 3 million years ago, 3.1 million years ago by now at least, that concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere were as high as they are today. 3.1 million years ago, Pliocene. Right, a very different world. Sea levels were between 20 and 60 meters higher than they are today. Temperatures were between 2 and 4 degrees, I believe, higher than they are today. So yes, right, it doesn't take much to realize that 60 meters of sea level rise is a very, very, very different world than from the world we live in. And no, people weren't around 3.1 million years ago. Of course not. Now, all right, just to be clear, in many ways, the point of the cost of climate change, right, it's not that the planet itself won't survive. The planet has been through this before. We have not. Right? I'm sitting here in New York City, actually, fairly high up for New York City, but I'm within 10 meters of global average sea levels here. Well, 3.1 million years ago, of course, this here was underwater. Never mind that, right, the continents have shifted in between, so it certainly didn't look like this. Now, the point, of course, is that it is CO2, anthropogenic CO2 put there by humans, by humanity, that is generating a world that looks very different from anything any one of us has ever experienced. And yes, it is the uncertainties, the not knowing, the fact, frankly, that climate scientists today are not predicting that sea levels would increase by as much as 20 to 60 meters because of the CO2 already there. Right? We are talking about 1 to 2 meters of sea level rise by the end of the century, which, just to be clear, that is bad enough. That should prompt us to act a long time ago, but frankly, that was my initial point. Right? The stuff we know is bad enough. We need to cut CO2 emissions in a major way, not by going back to our caves, our apartments, but by investing in clean, green, lean, mean, efficient infrastructure and re-guiding, rechanneling fundamental economic forces in the right direction. Through Germany, California, phasing out internal combustion engines, through China declaring itself to be carbon neutral. By the way, Europe too, of course, right? So these long-term goals, right, by now are in place. Are they ambitious enough already? No. Is there enough action already happening in support of them? No, not at all. I mentioned one last point quickly, the social cost of carbon figure, right, as the guide in how ambitious policy ought to be. Well, actually, almost regardless whether you think it's $50 or $100, but of course, especially if you believe it is at least $100 and higher, and frankly, we just don't know. Well, in Europe, right, 50% of CO2 emissions are covered under the current emissions trading system. That's a good thing. What's the price? Well, it's somewhere around 20, 30 euros. By now it is higher again, which is great, fantastic, right? It is 30 euros more than we here in the US are paying for the most part, California excluded now. But of course, that is not nearly ambitious enough. It is not nearly high enough relative to the true social cost of CO2 emissions.
Professore, vorrei fare un'ultima domanda collegata, tornando ad oggi. Lei parlava di necessità di investimenti infrastrutturali molto importanti per riconvertire, diciamo, l'assetto energetico mondiale ad un migliore utilizzo delle risorse e quindi a una minore emissione di CO2. Allora, però, oggi il mondo vive un'emergenza pandemica. Hi kids. Vive un'emergenza pandemica. I know them.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Di questa situazione attuale, non crede che
Can you hear me?
le persone, anche gli individui,
Don't you think
le
that people,
aziende, i governi,
companies, governments
potrebbero mettere in secondo piano, in secondo ordine gli
should
investimenti
attach
diciamo, di cui stiamo parlando, diciamo,
lower
economici, tanto per capirsi.
interest vis-à-vis the environment, because now we're having so many problems. There are jobs that are lacking. There are factories to be reorganized with social distancing. There's so much that is necessary. Do you think that there's still a determination to have insulation at homes, to have solar panels, so as to use less oil? And oil is even more, it's even cheaper now. Don't you think that this could be an obstacle to this?
We are not in an easy situation right now, not at all. Right, and just to give you a sense, so I'm sitting here in New York. I haven't left our apartment in quite a while, or yes, I've been outside, but my wife is a physician at one of the hospitals here that was hit the hardest, sort of the epicenter of the epicenter. So no, right, for several weeks in our lives this spring, I couldn't care less about climate change. If you asked me, there were different, more immediate problems. So to be clear, this hits home. Yes, it does. But back to the point of investing in low carbon, high efficiency technologies implies that we actually could employ many, many more people doing the kinds of things that we know is necessary and that, frankly, we aren't currently doing precisely because it would cost too much money. Why does it cost too much money to put solar panels here, right, on our roof? Why is that the case? Well, first of all, the price has come down significantly by a lot. That's a different point. But why does it cost more? Because it employs a lot of people. Why is the fossil fuel sector so, relatively speaking, so efficient in the sense that a lot of energy with minimal inputs? Well, other than the fact that when we burn a ton of coal or a barrel of oil, we are not currently, for the most part, paying for the consequences, the pollution consequences. But, well, it is a very labor efficient industry. Very little labor input to get a lot of energy out. Now, right, once the solar panel is on the roof, essentially, solar technology in many ways is a lot more efficient because there is no input needed other than the maintenance on the side, which is, of course, what scares electric utilities and energy companies, upfront investment, and then we just reap the benefits. Meanwhile, the installation process, the fact that every wind turbine has 100 tons of steel, the large ones, right? That costs money. That would employ a lot of people. Insulating homes, right, is one of these Green New Deal style projects that would reap a lot of benefits. Yes, cost money, but frankly, well, we are currently in the world where government ought to be spending a lot more, not currently doing that, right? Here in the US especially, where the stimulus bill, the next one is stuck in Congress and frankly permanently stuck, at least until we have the presidential inauguration. And the real problem is that we are not using the money that we should be spending in the kind of ways that would address not just one problem, the pandemic and the current economic deep freeze we are in, but frankly address another large systemic problem, climate change.
Allora, la ringrazio molto di questa
Thank you very much for your most interesting explanation. And as a matter of fact, in Europe, in our continent, government are certainly getting better aware. The new commission, as chaired by van der Leyen, said that investments being financed by European institutions should be targeted to a new development model to use energy more efficiently, reducing, curbing, mitigating pollution. So we should focus on that. Then the pandemics broke out with the need that Europe, as the other regions, invested heavily. And so we're now faced with a need to invest wisely. And we hope that this can contribute to bring about a leap forward in terms of infrastructures at European level. And in the meantime, we hope that in the States too, the new ruling class is more responsible and understands that efforts are to be made to safeguard the environment and the planet. So basically, we should be sensitive to that. Thank you very much, Professor Wagner. Thank you for your contribution, and hope to see you again in person here in Trento. Thank you. Grazie a voi.